Today, we are examining an entertainment news script covering the newly announced 2026 Raymond and Brown Joint Stadium Tour featuring Usher and Chris Brown, while exploring their enduring success amidst significant public controversies.
Yeah, and the material is actually exceptionally strong right out of the gate.
It really is.
Like, it balances those massive touring statistics with some really heavy cultural context. So that means we can just dive straight into some high-level structural and thematic enhancements.
Let's do it. I think the best place to start is just looking at how the narrative arc is currently structured, right?
Right, exactly. So restructuring the narrative arc will prevent an abrupt tonal collision between the promotional tour hype and the serious discussion of the artist's personal controversies.
Yeah, because right now, the script spends the entire first half just building this massive momentum.
It really does.
We get all these incredible details, right? Like Usher is 47, he just finished that massive past, present, future tour, he's accelerating his career, and then, it stacks Chris Brown right next to him.
With the Breezy Bowl XX tour.
Exactly, which grossed what, like $295.5 million? It's huge.
It's unbelievable numbers.
Right, so it hypes up the Charlotte date, it lists all these legendary tracks like Yay and With You, but then, right after establishing this huge celebration.
Boom.
Yeah, exactly. A hard pivot straight into Chris Brown's 2009 Rihanna incident and Usher's ties to Diddy's prostitution-related charges.
Right, and so the weakness here is just pure structural whiplash. By isolating those towering commercial achievements entirely from the heavy, the dark controversies, the piece basically feels like two distinctly different articles stitched together.
Right, it's like,
One is this highly enthusiastic hype piece, and the other is just a sudden true crime expose.
Yeah, it really feels like being at this massive stadium party, and then suddenly someone just unplugs the DJ booth to put on a true crime documentary.
That is the exact feeling.
Yes.
But, I have to ask, is there a risk that readers might feel blindsided? Or actually, if we move the Diddy and Rihanna stuff to the very beginning, don't we risk killing the celebratory hook of the announcement?
Well, yeah, you absolutely do not want to turn the opening into like a legal brief, right? Right. Nobody wants to read a court document when they're looking for tour dates.
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to weave the theme of their bulletproof career resilience into the introduction as a framing device.
Okay, I see.
So, you don't list the specific charges or the 2009 incident in the very first breath. Instead, you introduce the tension. If the author integrates this tension early on, the controversies feel like a natural, integrated part of their career retrospective.
rather than an obligatory footnote.
Right. It shouldn't feel like a separate footnote. We want the reader to understand from paragraph 1 that this tour is fascinating precisely because of the paradox these men represent.
Right, so it's really about setting the cognitive expectation for the reader. Like, if the author establishes that these are highly complex, polarizing figures, right as the motorcycles pull up in that April 10th announcement video, the reader's brain is primed.
Precisely. The excitement is still there, but it's grounded in a much more complicated reality.
So, what are some concrete examples of how we actually do this?
Sure. Let's look at how to execute this on a sentence level, and keeping in mind these are just a few out of all the possible ways you could solve this. Right after mentioning that cinematic announcement video, the author should immediately introduce the paradox of their success.
Like right away?
Right away. State early on that this tour is unprecedented, not just for its scale, but for the sheer resilience of its headliners.
Oh, I like that. So maybe using contrasting clauses, like despite a decade of headlines that would have permanently ended lesser careers, the two men pulling up on those motorcycles represent an unstoppable commercial force.
Yes, exactly. That allows the hype to exist right alongside the reality.
And then I guess when the script lists Chris Brown's upcoming album, Brown, and that lead single, Obvious, the author could note how his commercial output operates on this parallel track entirely separated from his public scrutiny.
That is a perfect execution of the strategy. You acknowledge the output, but you flag the scrutiny.
Right.
And the same principle applies to Usher. When the script mentions his accelerating career at 47, just briefly foreshadow that his legacy remains untarnished despite recent questions surrounding his formative years in New York.
You're just planting seeds.
Exactly. By doing this, you gently guide the reader into the deeper, darker conversation that comes later, which completely eliminates that structural whiplash.
Yeah, and honestly, if the author integrates that tension earlier, it actually opens up this really necessary space to dive deeper into the core thematic question, right?
The art versus artist debate.
Yes, which the script raises, but, it kind of leaves it unanswered.
Yeah, and that brings us perfectly to the next point. Expanding on the specific cultural mechanics of their enduring commercial power will elevate the piece from a standard news update into a highly compelling cultural analysis.
Right, because the material sets up a genuinely fascinating premise. I mean, it points out that fans separate the art from the artist to a degree that completely frustrates critics.
It really does.
It mentions Usher's recent Forbes interview, where he associated Sean Combs with the word legacy and claimed he was misrepresented.
Which sparked a massive debate.
Huge debate, but it didn't put a single dent in his ticket sales.
Right, and so the weakness here is that the script poses this amazing premise like, how do these men stay on top, despite everything? But it retreats just as the analysis gets interesting.
It sort of just points to the numbers.
Exactly. It points to nearly 2 million tickets sold by Brown as undeniable proof of fan loyalty, but it doesn't explore why or how this specific loyalty operates.
It stays on the surface.
The insight is entirely surface level. It tells us fans separate the art from the artist, but it ignores the machinery that allows them to do so.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second. The material establishes that the conversation is complicated, but it doesn't really complicate it for us. But, isn't it sometimes enough to just point out the contradiction? Like, fans buy the tickets, critics are outraged. End of story. Why does the author need to play psychologist here?
Because without exploring the why, the article remains just a simple timeline of events. It's not insightful journalism yet. When you're covering figures whose careers defy normal public relations logic, the story isn't that they survived, it's the mechanism of their survival.
The how.
Right. The suggestion is to unpack the psychology and cultural drivers behind these massive fan bases, giving the reader a deeper understanding of the Teflon nature of these two specific artists.
Okay, I see. Let me test the theory on how the author could unpack that. What if we explore the mechanism of nostalgia?
Okay, go on.
Like, is nostalgia just a fondness for the past, or is it something far more defensive? Because, if a fan hears a track from 2008 like Forever or With You, it's not really Chris Brown's song to them anymore.
Right. It's their song.
Exactly. It's the song that played at their own high school prom or during their first road trip. So by criticizing the artist, fans might feel their own formative memories are being attacked.
Oh, wow.
They aren't necessarily defending the artist's actions, they're fiercely defending their own youth.
That is a brilliant observation. And that is exactly the kind of psychological mechanism the author needs to explore. Nostalgia functions as an identity preservation tool.
Identity preservation, I love that.
Right? So for a concrete example, when the script mentions Chris Brown has faced additional allegations of misconduct, instead of just stating that he survives the backlash, the author can explore how this really deep catalog of multi-era hits serves as a Gnostic shield.
A nostalgic shield, right.
The music overpowers the headlines because it's a vital organ in the soundtrack of the audience's lives. Rejecting the artist requires an agonizing rejection of the fan's own personal history.
Yeah, once the author articulates that dynamic, the piece transforms entirely. It stops being a moral judgment on the fans, and it becomes this fascinating anthropological observation.
Exactly.
So, how do we apply that same level of deep analysis to Usher's situation? Because the script notes his Forbes interview sparked localized debate, but didn't affect his broader standing.
Well, to deepen that specific analysis, the author could briefly explore why that interview was ultimately ignored by the broader ticket-buying public. They could analyze how Usher's decades of highly polished, largely non-controversial behavior prior to this created a massive reservoir of public goodwill.
Oh, a reservoir of goodwill. So his fans might view him as a victim of a predatory environment rather than a perpetrator within it.
Exactly. That specific psychological framing is what allows his fans to categorize his legacy comment as misguided, generational loyalty rather than active complicity.
That makes so much sense.
And, these are just a few out of all the possible ways to dissect the cultural machinery. The main goal is just to show the reader how the audience rationalizes the contradiction.
Right. Well, if the music catalog basically acts as this massive PR shield for these artists, then the author needs to be extremely careful that the article's conclusion doesn't accidentally become part of that exact PR machine.
Oh, absolutely. Which leads us to the final point. Refining the vocabulary to maintain an objective editorial distance will strengthen the piece's overall credibility and prevent it from adopting the tone of a promotional press release.
Yeah, let's look at the specific language used in the final wrap-up of the script. The piece ends with, let's see. This is a full memory concert. 2 legends, 2 generations, 1 unforgettable stage. The Raymond Brown Tour is coming, and the world is already watching.
Right. And the weakness there is that the conclusion relies far too heavily on marketing speak.
It really does sound like a Live Nation ad.
It really does. And while the enthusiasm is totally understandable for an event this big, ending on language that sounds like it was lifted directly from a stadium billboard actively undermines the serious journalistic tone established just moments prior during the Diddy and Rihanna segments.
It kind of erodes all that editorial authority the author just worked so hard to build.
Exactly.
But I completely see what the author is going for here. They want to end on a high note. So if I'm the author, my instinct might be to just strip out the adjectives entirely. Like, just end on cold, hard facts to regain that distance.
Like what?
Like, the tour begins on July 17th at Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte. Tickets go on sale this Friday. Does that solve the problem?
Well, it certainly removed the PR speak, but it introduces a totally new weakness. It ends the piece on a purely logistical, dry note.
Right, it's boring.
It totally abandons the thematic depth and the sheer scale of the event you just spent pages building up.
True.
The suggestion is not to remove the excitement or the scale. The suggestion is to replace the hype-driven promotional language with authoritative observational statements that acknowledge the cultural magnitude of the tour without acting as a cheerleader for it.
So, communicating that it's a historic event, but using the vocabulary of an analyst rather than a publicist.
Yes.
So it comes down to the fundamental difference between a PR voice and an editorial voice. Like a PR voice relies on adjectives that instruct the reader on how to feel, words like unforgettable or legendary. But an editorial voice relies on analytical descriptors grounded in factual observation, words like scrutinized, dominant, or unprecedented.
That is the exact distinction. Let's provide some concrete examples of how to actually rewrite those final sentences. Okay, yeah. Instead of writing, "This is a full memory concert for multiple generations," the author can rewrite the sentiment to be analytical. You could say something like, "The set list bridges 3 decades of R&B, capitalizing heavily on an era-defining nostalgia that seems immune to outside controversy."
Oh, wow. I love that.
Notice how that sentence still acknowledges the massive scale of the music, but it maintains a critical observational distance.
It totally changes the temperature of the sentence. It honors the power of the music, but reminds the reader of that cultural force field surrounding it.
Right.
And what about that final tagline? 2 legends, 2 generations, 1 unforgettable stage. It's incredibly catchy, but it feels like a television commercial.
It's a great tagline for a commercial, but terrible for a piece of cultural commentary.
Yeah.
I would suggest replacing that entirely with an editorial summary of the phenomenon. So, for example, the Raymond Brown Tour represents an unprecedented moment in modern entertainment. 2 highly scrutinized figures mounting what will inevitably be one of the most culturally dominant and debated tours of the decade.
That phrasing is excellent. It honors the reality of their stadium-level dominance, but it still holds firmly onto the thematic thread of their public scrutiny.
Exactly. The reader is left pondering the complex nature of fame rather than just looking for a link to buy tickets.
And that's really the ultimate goal of a piece like this. You want the reader to walk away understanding not just what is happening, but why it is happening, and what it says about our culture.
Totally.
Well, let's quickly recap the 3 main takeaways from today's critique.
Sure.
First, the author needs to weave the overarching theme of resilience and controversy throughout the structure from the very beginning. Using the paradox of their success as a framing device will prevent that tonal whiplash that currently disrupts the piece.
Right.
Second, the author must deepen the art versus artist analysis. So instead of just stating that fans separate the art from the artist, explain the psychological mechanisms of nostalgia and identity preservation that give these specific stars their Teflon nature.
Yes, absolutely.
And third, the author must tone down the PR-style closing language, replacing marketing adjectives with authoritative observational statements to maintain editorial credibility right through to the final period.
And implementing these structural, analytical, and tonal edits will completely transform the piece. It takes a solid compilation of touring statistics and controversy timelines and turns it into a brilliant, cohesive piece of cultural commentary.
We warmly invite the listener to apply these edits and submit the revised draft back to the show for further review. When you sit down to rewrite this script, remember that your greatest asset isn't the ticket sales statistics you report, but the cultural tension you are willing to explore.
Exactly.
The most compelling stories don't just ask us to marvel at the gleaming facade of a skyscraper. They demand that we examine the fault line it is built upon.